My name is Randall Eggert. This class is Grammar and Stylistics. It's about writing clearly.
Punctuation, writing versus speaking. In this video, we're going to be talking about what a lot of people consider to be a dry topic of language and writing, which is punctuation. But as we're going to see, punctuation is far more interesting than most people would expect. What we're going to be looking at, especially in this video, is the differences between spoken language and written language. And what I'm going to argue is that written language has evolved in such a way that it's diverged in certain ways from spoken language. Originally, it was meant to be just a representation of spoken language, but it's existed long enough that it's taken on some of its own rules, independent of spoken language. The first distinction we need to make is between a grammatical sentence and a punctuated sentence. The two types of sentences have some different properties. First of all, grammatical sentence. This applies to both speaking and writing. When we talk about speaking, we often talk about a sentence, a grammatical sentence. But we also talk about it in writing. It exists in writing equally. But of course, a punctuated sentence only exists in writing. There's no such thing as spoken punctuation. A grammatical sentence generally represents a complete thought. And a punctuated sentence as well often represents a complete thought. Now, this is a pre-theoretical idea. We're not talking about something that we can objectively identify a complete thought or not, but it's, I think, intuitively pretty straightforward. The difference here, though, is that a punctuated sentence can represent one or more closely related thoughts. So oftentimes, there may be more than one thought represented in a punctuated sentence, but they're considered close enough that for practical purposes, we could see them as being one extended thought. Another difference is that grammatical sentences are part of mental grammar. It's part of what allows us to speak a language. We need this unconscious understanding of it. And we develop that very young. For whatever language it is that we're speaking as our first language, we develop a notion of what is a grammatical sentence in that language early on, starting from about the age of 2. A punctuated sentence, though, is not something that we acquire naturally. That's something that we learn because we learn writing later, right? We learn to speak pretty much from the day that we're born. We start the process of acquiring spoken language. But written language comes later, several years later. And in fact, there's no need to have written language. There are many people who can only speak. They can't write. And the notion of a punctuated sentence, then, is dependent on a grammatical sentence. And, of course, not vice versa. Grammatical sentence exists independent of punctuated sentences. Okay, now here's our definitions coming from Williams and Bizzo. A grammatical sentence is a subject and verb and a main clause along with everything else depending on that clause. Now, I would take a little bit of an issue here in saying just verb. I think a better word here would be predicate. A predicate is always a verb phrase, not just a verb. Because when we're talking about sentence structure, we're really talking about a noun phrase subject and a verb phrase predicate. And we'll see that a little bit more in a moment. His definition of punctuated sentence, or Williams' definition of punctuated sentence, I think is quite good. It's very simple. It just begins with a capital letter and ends with end punctuation. Now, that will include many things that most readers will consider to be ungrammatical punctuated sentences. So they start with a capital letter, they end with end punctuation, but inside there's some grammatical issues having to do with grammatical sentence. And as I said, a punctuated sentence to a large degree depends on a grammatical sentence. So for it to be a grammatical punctuated sentence, it first has to be a grammatical sentence. Okay, so here's our structure. We've got our sentence, We've got our noun phrase subject, which is the daughter of that sentence, and we've got our verb phrase predicate. And then Williams adds this optional intro element. I talk about this in a previous video where I go over sentence structure. In that video, I refer to this optional element as an adverbial. It's often an adverb. It could be a preposition phrase. It could be a participle phrase. Williams also likes to include subordinate clauses in there. I prefer to kind of think of that as being a separate entity than the adverbial or intro element. Since I just mentioned subordinate clauses, I want to make sure that we're on the same page again. And again, I talked about this in a previous video. So I use this notation that we call this an S bar. So a subordinate clause, we represent it with an S plus this little quote bar. And it consists of a subordinator, sometimes referred to as subordinating conjunction. They're really quite different from conjunction, so I prefer just saying subordinator so we don't confuse the two. And a grammatical sentence. That is, it's got to consist of a noun phrase subject and a verb phrase predicate. That's our subordinate clause. And then you can create complex sentences by combining a subordinate clause with a sentence. And it can combine either before or after the main clause sentence. And that gives you then this complex sentence. All right, so with that, we move to subjects. As I said before, the subject of a clause is the noun phrase daughter of an S. And our definition of object is twofold. If it's the object of a verb, then it's the noun phrase daughter of a verb phrase. And if it's the object of a preposition, then it's the noun phrase daughter of a preposition phrase. I go over all of this in more depth in a previous video, but I wanted to remind you of our terminology. The way that punctuation sometimes gets taught is that punctuation represents pauses. So a comma represents a short pause, a period represents a longer pause, and a semicolon represents a pause somewhere in between there. There's some logic to that. We can see that in a sentence like this. Grant, as I said, is in love with Gertrude. So here we've got our subject, our noun phrase, subject, Grant. We've got our verb phrase, is in love with Gertrude. And normally, the noun phrase would be followed immediately by the verb phrase. In this case, we've got something interrupting that flow. And because of that interruption, we like to surround it with pauses when we're speaking, and in writing, we likewise surround it by commas. And so in that sense, it makes sense to say that a comma represents a pause. The problem is that it doesn't work that way across the board. So I want you to consider this one. By the way, the asterisk means that this is not grammatical. So this is not appropriate punctuating here. It's a perfectly fine grammatical sentence, but the punctuation is problematic. So I'm going to read the sentence, and I want you to notice where I pause. The constant change which Humpty Dumpty talks about is neither practical nor responsible. Now, you can have a nice, long, noticeable pause here. The problem is that that's not an acceptable place to put a comma. Similarly, Percy didn't approve of the idea, but his wife was very keen. Now, we had a pause here and a pause here. The first comma, golden. That's a good place for a comma. The second comma, nope. You can't put a comma there. I'll have a subsequent video trying to explain a bit why you don't put commas in positions like that. And then finally, here's another example. It is true that it is not necessary to state this entire phrase. Again, it sounds right to put a pause here, but a comma is not appropriate. My point is that if you were taught that commas always represent pauses, that can get you in trouble, because then you think that anytime there's a pause, you should put in a comma. But it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. As I said, written language has evolved separately from spoken language. All right, So continuing with this, I want you to think about these three sentences. And I want you to notice that in spoken language, when I read these aloud, I really can't distinguish between the three. If I were to read these in a random order, I don't think you could guess which one I'm reading. So I'll read all three, but it's not going to change. He reported the decision. We were forbidden to speak with the chairman directly. He reported the decision. We were forbidden to speak with the chairman directly. He reported the decision. We were forbidden to speak with the chairman directly. But I want you to think in your head about the difference in meaning between each one of these. The first one with the colon, I think you know, as a good reader, you probably sense that there is a meaning that's imposed on us by that colon. Namely, what we're understanding is that this is the decision. The decision is we were forbidden to speak with the chairman directly. Whereas in this one, it's a little bit different. It's more of an explanation. Probably the best interpretation is probably giving a reason why he reported the decision and not the chairman, right? So he reported the decision. We were forbidden to speak with the chairman directly. And in this one, where there's a dash, I want you to think about that one, because in this case, I don't think you can tell which of these two meanings was intended. This one is more ambiguous, which means that the dash is in some ways more similar to spoken language. And there is that sort of understanding of the dash, that it's somehow more informal, a little bit more off the cuff, which is more similar to the way the spoken language works. And so it's in that way, I don't think it's should be surprising that the dash would be more similar to the way that we speak. All right, continuing with this, I want to summarize what I'm getting at. Just because we know how to speak does not mean that we know how to punctuate. Writing has evolved to have its own rules distinct from speaking. Punctuation is an example.